Hello and welcome to Tech Deal's graphics card performance comparison. Today we are testing 4 different graphics cards. The RX 570 4GB card against the GTX 1060 3GB card, the RX 580 8GB card against the GTX 1060 6GB card. Now these cards range in price from about $170 to about $250 when I'm filming this in 2017. There will be links in the video description below to both Amazon and Newegg for all 4 sets of graphics cards. By all means, compare prices and buy it where it makes the most sense to you. All 4 cards were installed in the same computer. It's my $1,500 i7 7700K build running at a fixed 4.7 GHz on all 4 cores. Link to that build video in the video description below. Fraps was used for the frame performance numbers you will see at the end of this video, but it was not used to capture any of this video. Instead, AMD's Relive and NVIDIA's Shadowplay were used to record the gameplay you're watching. Add 5% on average if you're not recording, but if you're live streaming or recording, this is exactly the performance you can expect to get. Finally, the numbers in green at the top left corner of the screen are from MSI Afterburner, a free program you can download and use to monitor your system's performance in real time while playing games. This is a very handy tool to figure out what is the limitation to your system's performance. Is it your CPU, your RAM, your graphics card? I use this all the time, and if you want to find out what the bottleneck or limit in your system is, I recommend you do so as well. Now take a look at the real-time numbers in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. I do want to call something very specific to your attention because it will make clear the results you see at the end of this video. Now we are playing in 1440p resolution at maximum detail. Traditionally, these cards are really more meant for 1080p gaming, but World of Tanks is the kind of game you can get away with stepping up a resolution with any different set of graphics cards. So RX 570 or 580 or GTX 1060 would normally be 1080p cards. 1440p for World of Tanks is fine. If you wanted to play at 4K, my recommendation would be a GTX 1070, although actually the 580 and the 6GB 1060 would actually work at 4K just fine if you're okay to turn the detail down a notch or so and play with those just a bit. However, the graphics card that we're using here, the RX 570, is the Mini ITX Sapphire. Its clock speed is not maintaining what it's advertised to be at. It's at 70 degrees centigrade, the fan's turning at 1500 RPM. This is a good budget graphics card if you need a Mini ITX card. I would not recommend it if you have room for one of the dual fan cards. In the Ghost Recon Wildland comparison video, I used an Asus Republic of Gamers Strix card which maintained a solid 1300 MHz clock speed. Now that card costs about $20 more than this one does, but it's worth it if you've got the room for it. Except for the fact that the RX 580 starts at just $10 more and has another 40 MHz clock speed and faster RAM and more shaders. So until the prices adjust a bit, this is kind of where the RX 570s are having trouble with. They're good cards, just not quite at the price they were launched at. But just like we saw with the RX 470 compared to the RX 480, very quickly after launch, the prices started to deviate further, and you can find RX 470s in the 150 range, sometimes after mail-in rebates even less. Now those cards are going to be discontinued shortly. The supplies and stocks will dry up. If you can find an RX 470 for 150 or less, it's a deal. Much better than the 570s are at the moment, although frankly the 570s will drop in price as well. But when you look at the performance at the end of this video between the 570 and the 580, and then you consider the price difference. Now, of course, I'm using an 8GB RX 580 here, but the fact is a 4GB would perform exactly the same. The 8 gigs of VRAM is completely unnecessary for most of the games that I'm testing, certainly for World of Tanks, which absolutely doesn't need it. It's not just the average frame rates, it's the minimum frame rates, it's the frame pacing and smoothness. The RX 580 at the moment really is a better deal if you can swing it. However, if you have a Mini ITX system or a pre-built system from, say, Acer, Dell, HP, Lenovo, and you don't have room for a dual fan larger cooler, this is, well, kind of your only option if you want to go AMD. Unless, of course, you go to the GTX 1060. Speaking of the GTX 1060, here is the 3GB card. Price-wise, this is very close to the RX 570 at the moment. Now, traditionally, you'd have spent $200 to $220 on a 3GB GTX 1060, but there are now available GTX 1060 3GB cards down in the $170 price range, and many of these cards are single fan and run very well. You will get excellent performance out of the single fan 1060s, whereas you really don't out of the single fan 470s and 570s just because of temperature and cooling and whatnot. Frankly, if you have a mini ITX system, if you have a pre-built, my general recommendation is the 1060 because there are far more choices, they run cooler, they make less noise, and they just are overall easier to put into smaller packages. If you can get a larger card, especially the mid-level RX 580s, the value for the money is excellent. Now let me draw your attention to the real-time performance numbers. I didn't talk about them a whole lot on the previous run because it was relatively short. But essentially our VRAM usage is just over 2 gigabytes. We are at 1440p. Our frame rate is awesome at about 80 frames per second. Our main system RAM is relatively trivial. 8 gigs would be absolutely plenty for this. Our i7 is loafing along at under 20% usage. And our graphics card is humming along just fine at 99%. Now, World of Tanks, unlike World of Warships, will run at up to 120 frames per second. And the fact that we're not at 120 frames a second does in fact indicate that we are 100% totally graphics card bound here. If you want to maintain a higher average and more importantly, a higher minimum frame rate, yes, I'll show you those charts here in a minute, then at 1440p, you would need to upgrade to a GTX 1070 or AMD's upcoming Vega. Now, Vega has not been announced. I don't have any information about it yet. I'm hoping that we get some of that soon because, frankly, we need some competition at the higher end of the market. Go AMD. And I promise as soon as I get anything on Vega that I can share with you, I will. But at the moment, I don't. So we're just kind of waiting on them. Still, while performance is GPU bound, we are at 95 frames per second. How much do you really need? I mean, do you need 120 frames a second? If you are a competitive, serious player, well, yes, you do. You can either play at 1080p, in which case you would get 120 frames a second, or you're going to have to spend more on your graphics card. Consider that we're currently getting 80 plus frames. Well, okay, with the grass and the foliage, we're getting 70 plus frames per second on a $170, $190, depending upon the card, GTX 1060. You would have to spend nearly double the price of this graphics card in order to get 120 frames per second. How much money do you want to spend to get that extra frame rate? Or are you willing to come down to 1080p? Now, there is a third option. We are at maximum graphics detail. Lower the detail down to high. You don't have to play on maximum. If you take the detail from maximum and turn it down to high, or turn off full screen anti-aliasing, which I do have on here, you will also get more performance. So you have options in how you want to get there. Either maximum detail, more graphics card, lower the resolution, or adjust the graphics detail settings. Now, this is of course the HD client, and my understanding is World of Tanks is due for yet another upgrade to the graphics. I think later this year, or perhaps even this summer, we may be getting another patch. When that comes out, I'll definitely take a look at it. But for now, under $200 graphics card, 1440p, what awesome performance is this? Let's take a look at the RX 580 8GB graphics card. Now, as I said before, the 8 gigs is completely irrelevant. The 4 gigs would be exactly the same performance that you're seeing right here. However, I want you to look at the clock speed of the graphics card. We're at 1425. The RX 570 that I showed you is the least expensive single-fan mini ITX non-overclocked 570 available on the market today. This is the fastest factory overclocked super premium RX 580 available. Why do I point that detail out? Because I do want to be fair to the cards. We are comparing an entry-level 570 to a top-of-the-line 580. The basic $220, $230 RX 580 8GB cards have a 1340 to 1365 megahertz clock speed. This is 1425. Now, how much difference does that make in the real world? A couple of percent. We are talking less than 5 frames per second difference. It's not as much as you'd think. Do the math. The difference between 1425 megahertz and 1340 is less than 100 megahertz. It's less than 10%. In fact, when you take everything into account, RAM speed, shader count, system bottlenecks, and everything else, you're looking at 3 to 5% performance difference, give or take. It's there, it's real, but it's not really the reason to buy these top-end cards. Now, you may think, well, don't you buy the super factory overclock cards for performance? Well, yeah, certainly it gets you extra performance. Fan speed, cooling, temperature, and overclockability is why you buy these. Look at the fan speed. We're running at 1300 RPM, just over 1300 RPM on this card. We are at 69 degrees Celsius at a 39% fan speed. We are 300 megahertz clock speed higher than the RX 570. We have more shaders here. We've got over 2,300 shaders on this versus the 2,000 shaders on RX 570. And yet our card is running cool and virtually silent. This card with 2 big fans running substantially faster than the Mini ITX Sapphire card makes less noise. It's those huge fans and the massive heat sink that get you lower noise. One of the reasons to buy these factory overclock cards is not performance. I mean, yes, it has more performance, and yes, you could potentially overclock this higher, but you're getting a quieter card with big fans and a cool card. It's got RGB lighting and nice features, and it's a very nice card. It's well built and it looks really sharp. So if you care about those things, it's a little bit more expensive than the base cards, but hey, best RX 580, there you go. Look at our frame rate. We're over 100 frames per second. Now, that doesn't mean it's always that good. We're driving across an open field at the moment. Probably going to get shot in a second. But the performance on this card at this clock speed is noticeably better than the RX 570 was. Now, please note, the RAM speed here is higher. The RX 580s have 2,000 megahertz base clock RAM. Now it's DDR, a GDDR5, but it's 2,000 megahertz RAM. We have more shaders. We have a higher clock speed. There's a lot of little things that make the 580 faster than the 570. Personally, if there's not about a $50 difference between the 570s and the 580s, I'd buy a 580. It's worth the extra money. Even if you don't necessarily need the performance today, it will buy you longevity. You'll be able to use the card maybe another year potentially with the extra performance, and certainly with the extra VRAM. I really want to see the 570s in the 150 or less price category, which is really where I think they belong. The 570s just launched. Give them a month or two. They'll be down there. Now, I could sit here and show you this whole battle, but hey, performance is awesome. Now let's take a look at the GTX 1060 6GB card. The main reason I'm putting this on the video is a lot of people play World of Tanks, and some people may want to play it at higher resolutions. And so I want to show what traditionally 1080p cards do at 1440p, which is why I'm not bothering at 1080p. When I do the RX 560 versus GTX 1050 or 1050 Ti or whatever that comes out this summer, I'll do those at 1080p in this game. Those cards are plenty. If you want to play World of Tanks at 1080p, a 460 or 560 or a 1050 or 1050 Ti is all you really need. Now, these cards will play them lock solid, steady at 120 frames a second, no issue. It just depends on whether or not you want 120 frames a second or 80 to 100. For those of you curious, now I've mentioned what the RX cards are. The GTX 1060 3GB card in this video is the MSI Gaming X. This one here, the GTX 1060 6GB card, is the EVGA for the Win card. Now, traditionally, I've recommended in the past the superclocked single fan cards. I still do. Price, however, does come into play, and if you've got room for this card, you gain the benefit of a lower noise profile or at least lower fan speeds. The fans are turning at about 1100 RPM at 37%. This card is completely silent. It makes like no noise at all. Even when the side of the case is off, even when the machine is 2 feet away, this thing is silent. In the past, I've said don't bother with the For the Win card, just get the super clocked. It's not worth the money difference. However, at the moment, the For the Win is very competitively priced. That's why you've got to check the links in the video description below, because I've got them all listed so you can compare the price. I'll have them sorted. On Newegg, at least, it's easy for me to sort them price lowest to highest. The super clocked has one fan, and they're basically the same performance. Now, technically, the For the Win has a slightly higher out of the box clock speed, but because they both use GPU Boost 3.0 and they both auto overclock, they both end up at about 2 gigahertz. There's really no performance difference. It's just size, fan count, aesthetics, that sort of thing. Now, as much as I'd love to leave that entire battle in there, let's take a look at the results. At 1440p, World of Tanks, max detail settings, the RX 570 averaged 66 frames per second, with a 1% minimum of 51 and a 0.1% minimum of 47. Completely playable, if not perfect in all respects. If you compare its numbers to the RX 580, you'll notice they're dramatically different. This is why I emphasized while I was doing the voiceover about the clock speeds, because some people may say, wait a minute, the average performance there is dramatically different. Clock speeds, that RX 570 is the slowest, weakest of the RX 570 cards versus the best of the best. If you buy a middle-of-the-road RX 570 and compare it to a middle-of-the-road RX 580, those numbers will be closer together. The problem, at least at the moment, with prices is that you're looking at cards that are $10 or $20 apart, and there's no point in buying a 570 if it's only $10 or $20 less than a 580. Now, how do the two GTX 1060s compare? Exactly like you should expect them to. The 1060 6GB card has about 10% more compute resources, more shaders, than a 3GB card, and we see roughly that much more performance. The VRAM doesn't make a difference, but the compute performance does. We have an average of 87 versus 95 frames per second between the two cards. But let's talk about the 1% and the 0.1% minimums. Now, short version is the 1% minimums means the red bars are what you'll get 99% of the time or better. The blue bars represent what you'll get 99.9% of the time, or effectively all the frames. Now, these aren't true minimums because there are a handful of frames perhaps dropped out, but 1% and 0.1% minimums drop out that one frame in a 5 or 10 minute benchmark that just hiccuped and isn't really going to affect your enjoyment of the game. I personally believe the red bars are the ones you should pay the most attention to, with secondary attention paid to average frame rate. Look at that 1% number on the RX 570, and then go back and watch the game. I left the entire replay in there. It is worth noting that MSI Afterburner only updates about 1 time per second, whereas Fraps is recording every single frame. So Fraps is going to catch lower frame rates than will necessarily appear in the real-time performance of MSI Afterburner, because it actually records the milliseconds of every single frame in the game. That being said, I challenge you to find anything in there that wasn't totally playable and perfect. All these cards are fine, and we are in fact playing at 1440p on cards that are really meant for 1080p. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with that big huge button directly below the video. Post your comments below the video, and as always, check out the video description. Links to everything down there. The full build list of the i7 7700K machine will be down there. Links to Amazon and Newegg for all these cards will be down there. And most importantly, my link to my Patreon will be down there. Do you like my videos, my game performance videos, my how-to guides, my build videos? Do you want me to stay independent and keep making all these great videos for you? I need your support. Anything you can contribute helps tremendously, and every dollar goes right back into the channel so I can keep making all these videos for you. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.